One thing that I haven't really talked about a lot on this channel so far is that I'm very heavily influenced by the Vermont secessionist movement and by localist politics more generally. The Vermont secessionist movement is not super well known, and it caught my eye partly because it happened right over in Vermont, which is very geographically nearby and very geographically similar to the state of New Hampshire. And one of the other reasons it caught my eye is because it does propose an alternative politics to the sort of the mainstream Democrat and Republican parties. Normally when you see alternatives proposed, you're seeing either libertarians or socialists as alternatives to the two-party system. But I think that the left in general, they have a tendency to endorse big government, right? Whether they are liberals who endorse centralizing more taxation in the hands of the state as opposed to local government, and centralizing more authority in the hands of federal government over more states' rights approaches, building stronger international coalitions like the United Nations, or you go even farther left and you get socialists who literally want to have like unitary state or a world government sometimes, and who want to have central economic planning. There's a heavy tendency on the left towards centralization of authority in the hands of bigger and bigger centralized government. And then on the right, there is much more criticism of big government and centralization, but they seem very comfortable with the fact that the market concentrates more and more of the economy in the hands of smaller and smaller numbers of people, whether that is CEOs of massive corporations or the economic power that comes with highly concentrated wealth, like millionaires and billionaires. I think the left is much more critical of economic power and of corporate power. I see localists as really the only group of people that view these things as two sides of the same coin. They see economic and corporate concentration of power as bad, and they see big government as also bad in the same way. And they want to do away with what they would call gigantism of both forms. And I think you need to have that sort of principled opposition to power of all kinds. The only other group that really sort of aligns with this, weirdly enough, is anarchism, specifically social anarchism, as opposed to libertarian anarcho-capitalism, right? So you read anarchist texts and localist texts, and there's a lot of overlap in terms of the political thought there, even though you might not think of that if you're not super experienced with reading these authors. Generally speaking, this makes it very difficult to apply localism to any actual real-world applications, though. And in practice, I've found that most anarchists sort of default to being idealistically anarchist. Like, yeah, man, wouldn't it be great if one day we had anarchism? Well, in terms of actual, like, practical policy proposal in the short term, they default to just being Democrats. Like, if you think about it, does it actually make any sense whatsoever for somebody who believes in directly democratic communes with moneyless societies where everybody contributes completely freely and voluntarily, and where all decisions are made through direct democracy on a local communal level? Does it make sense for that person to advocate universal health care or to join the Green Party? Not really. No. Like, universal health care, I guess, is sort of a step in the direction of the society they want, in the sense that it pushes back against meritocracy and creates a more altruistic relationship between collective society and the individual, right, in some broad way. But ultimately, it is a state creating a government policy. It doesn't make any sense for them to endorse that. but most anarchists sort of tacitly go along with that. If you are somebody who believes in sort of old school central planning socialism, then the endorsement of the Democrats as a short-term strategy, to me, makes sense. It's like a step in the right direction, sort of. And I do think there is a lot of electoral socialism and electoral state communism, you could say. There are socialist parties with real practical policies, and there are socialist-y think tanks, right? There aren't really anarchist think tanks. There aren't anarchist political candidates. Bernie Sanders is not an anarchist political candidate quite as much as he is a socialist political candidate. So one of the things I've been trying to do is bridge that gap. And I think localist politics starts to get at how to bridge that. There is this great book by Richard Schragger called City Power, in which he argues that progressives have massively overestimated the degree to which state governments are amenable to the interests of progressive politics, and have underestimated the ability of local governments, particularly very liberal urban centers like cities, enacting more progressive policies. He says that when we empower state governments to preempt local governments, a lot of times you get more moderate legislatures or maybe more Republican legislatures, and they use preemption to prevent more progressive-minded cities from adopting policies that might be beneficial to their constituencies. And additionally, in the absence of these more progressive policy implementations, what a lot of local governments have started to do is they've started to take on this disposition that their primary goal and their primary role in development is to attract outsiders to their local area. They want to make themselves attractive to people trying to move here. And what we found historically is that this does not work. You cannot really use state investment to plan on getting more tourists coming in. You can't win people over to coming to your state or your local government. It doesn't really work that way. The equation for why people come to live in a certain place is too complicated for state planners to consistently achieve that goal. It's much better to just try to serve the immediate interests of the people who live there and to make the community as desirable a place to live for the people who are already there, and hope that maybe sometimes that also makes it more attractive to outsiders as well, than to actively try to win people over. And so one thing that localists draw a lot of attention to is government spending on things like, I think sports stadiums are a really great example. Let's build a sports stadium to get people from the next state over to come into our town and our city to watch these sports. And they're going to be like, oh, they have the sports stadium right there. We gotta move there. They've got a sports stadium. Meanwhile, we're underinvesting in fixing the roads and fixing the bridges and actually like having good infrastructure for the people who live in those towns and those cities. So we invest too much on flashy things that are supposed to attract outsiders, and we underinvest in practical things that people actually need. And you can actually see this happening across New Hampshire right now. There's a lot of flashy redevelopment projects and beautification projects. We're trying to make all of our places to live very, very pretty to draw people in. But there's not enough in the budget for roads. One of the main barriers for a localist politics is interregional inequality, because Democrats are, I think, correct, at least to a degree, that on a neighborhood by neighborhood level, Some neighborhoods are very poor and some neighborhoods are very wealthy. Other neighborhoods are rural, while some neighborhoods are urban. And it might be harder for, say, a poor rural area. Here in New Hampshire, that's a place like Claremont, to fund their own education system, to have a school, and to have a well-funded education for their children, which is a vital service that local government people are obviously very, very interested in protecting. It's much harder for them to do that if they're a poor community. And so the emphasis has become on how do we get money out of rich communities and into poor communities. It's redistribution. It's redistribution that's not really being described as redistribution, but as far as I can tell, it is redistribution. The goal is to centralize more taxation, to move away from property taxes, and this is exactly how they advertise themselves. They say, we're low-tax Democrats. We're Democrats who want to lower your property taxes. And people are like, well, I don't like taxes. So they sort of pander to conservative impulses within the general population of desires to have lower taxes, when what's really being described as tax centralization and redistribution. They're moving taxation from local property taxes to more state-level taxes. In the long run here in New Hampshire, ideally, that would mean the implementation of a broad-based sales or income tax that could take some of the weight off of our local property taxes. Now, I don't necessarily think any of these policies would be a bad thing to do in the short term. I don't want poor kids in poor neighborhoods to suffer for my principles. But in the long term, we have to ask ourselves, where is this inequality coming from? And is this really a long-term solution? Because poor neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods aren't fixed things. They're not fixed things that just exist across time, and they necessarily must be poor neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods. We have a system that creates poverty. We have a system that creates concentrated wealth. And if we alter that system at the core of our economic institutions, then we can create stronger neighborhoods that can fund their own schools on a local basis. And so I think maybe a principled coalition that tries to build stronger local economies and tackle wealth inequality could create the conditions for actually devolving authority down from state governments to local governments. So what does this look like policy-wise? I think, first of all, what needs to be done is we need to move away from tacitly accepting chain stores, franchises, and massive corporations in our communities and tailoring our policy to these institutions. We definitely need to stop trying to have the next Amazon warehouse be opened in our community to provide jobs for our citizens as opposed to other towns. You end up with these things called races to the bottom, where various cities or local communities try to make their environment as amenable as possible to these massive corporations, which could mean lower taxes and cuts to vital public services, or it could also mean higher taxes and subsidies for these corporations, what's called corporate welfare. And they're trying to make themselves as amenable of a business environment as possible to attract these mega corporations so that the politicians there can tell their constituencies, hey, we created jobs. We created jobs for you in your community instead of this other community. We need to stop doing that. We need to do the exact opposite of that, and we need to resist these mega corporations, and we need to protect local small enterprises. If you think about it, if you're a worker and you work at like a McDonald's, McDonald's is not owned, I assume, by somebody in New Hampshire. I assume whoever owns McDonald's or the shareholders of McDonald's, let's say, most of them are not probably living in New Hampshire. So if you work at a McDonald's, your money is going out of state. And if there are taxes to redistribute that wealth, they're going to need to be implemented on a national or even a multinational level, which how do you even implement multinational taxes? They're going to need to be implemented on that very centralized scale for that redistribution to happen. So you need to cut it off at the core. You need to cut it off at the root. You need to prevent that extraction from taking place prior to that money leaving your community. So the way you do that is by having more local small enterprises where even if your boss makes $1 while you make a dime, your boss's dollar can be taxed within your community and given back to vital public services in your own neighborhood. So even if there are really wealthy people in your community and there's a stark divide between the poor and the rich, those wealthy people can pay taxes, and your community can make them pay taxes. And we don't have that ability so long as we don't have ownership in our communities and in our neighborhoods. So I think we need to pair local ownership and a localization of the economy with higher wages, stronger unions, stronger collective bargaining, and any sort of policies that just generally push back against wealth and income inequality at its core, at the place where it happens. Because it's not enough to allow this system to extract wealth from us all and then create a second bureaucratic state system that redistributes the wealth that was created by the first system. We have to cut off the wealth inequality generation at its core. It needs to not be about redistribution, but about initial distribution. I've even heard it referred to in the literature as pre-distribution, which is a silly word, but I get what they're getting at. We need to have what's called community wealth building. And I got sources in the description for the Vermont Secessionist Republic, for City Power by Richard Schragger, and for books on community wealth building and how we can build our communities economically so that this extraction is cut off at its core.